Hello, my name is Jordan Lee Jerome Petrie. Before I start this presentation, I just want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation and respect and recognize them for being stewards and custodians of this land, Jochake, a historical a meeting place for diverse indigenous groups such as the Anishinaabe, the Algonquin people, and the Mi'kmaq. All right, so let's get this party started. Who's ready? I know I am. Okay. All right. So this is the title, Relational Epistemology, Indigenous Pedagogies. Yeah, so let's get started. I just want to start here with a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. You must always remember that the fire has two sides. Both are very powerful. One side is for the force of creation. Fire can be used for good, like on your earth or in ceremony, but for the same power can be turned to destruction. We must learn to be careful or it can destroy everything that has been created. We have to create balance, which is the metaphor I'm going to be using throughout my presentation, alongside the theory of open-mindedness and also the theory of two-eyed seeing, which is the Mi'kmaq framework, which I am a Mi'kmaq from the community of Geskabigiag, which means that you basically see through indigenous ways of knowing and in Western ways of knowing, and you're able to overlap these both views into that benefits us all. Okay, so let's get started. Introduction, decolonizing education. The topic will be exploring the decolonizing education in the context of Indigenous cultural reclamation through a Canadian lens. We will examine into the historical impact of residential schools, the rise of Indigenous pedagogies, challenges in combining Indigenous and mainstream education, and a final comparative analysis, which I'll give my future recommendations and areas of research. And this is the target of for audiences for educators, both instructors, land-based, and or teachers and profs within the academy. Yeah, so the significance, it's important because this discussion is critical for understanding and rectifying historical injustices due to colonialism and even ongoing colonization. And it's key to creating a culturally inclusive and educational framework within the academy. My thesis statement, it is an exciting one, integrating land-based education, which is embedded in Indigenous ways of knowing and in Indigenous knowledges, which addresses historical colonial trauma, like I mentioned, by promoting community values within mainstream academia, which is critical for cultural reclamation, reconciliation, and holistic healing, which I find very interesting, especially in terms of spirituality with us perpetuating the process of decolonization while using Indigenous frameworks and pedagogies. Okay, so here we have key terms. Yeah, there's a lot of them. So the first one I guess I'm going to go over with is decolonization. It refers to the process of dismantling the effects of colonialism, particularly in restoring Indigenous autonomy in education and cultural practices. It's about recentering like Indigenous voices and wisdom in spaces where it feels culturally safe, which they have often been marginalized, especially like through residential schools. Yeah, and then also land-based education with emphasizes learning that's deeply rooted in engagement with the land, and this approach values ecological knowledge, ecological learning, hands-on skills, important Indigenous learning methods. Yeah, so Indigenous paradigm. Well, first, let's start with axiology here. It's the study of values and the ethics, particularly as they relate to cultural and Indigenous cultural values and principles. Epistemology is Indigenous ways of knowing and seeing, which include traditional knowledge, systems, stories, and lived experiences. Ontology is the study of nature of being and the existence and understanding in Indigenous, I guess, philosophies, which a lot of their philosophy is based off of spirituality. Indigenous paradigm, a holistic worldview rooted in Indigenous knowledge systems, focusing on the interconnectedness of life. I've mentioned land-based education, interconnectedness. Here, so I'll move here. The belief in the critical connection among all living things in the land and how everything is connected through the environment. Traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous knowledge is about ecosystems, biodiversity, sustainable resource management, oral transmitted through, passed down through generations, relational learning. A learning approach is focused on building relationships with the land, group building, and problem solving within the community, and without I guess, view too much of an educator. Let's just say it's basically it's a complete opposite of the top-down approach. It's more of an up approach. And Indigenous pedagogies, which is, like I mentioned, the methods in teaching and education with a particular emphasis on how these are applied in Indigenous communities and contexts. And then ceremony and research, which I find is very important, especially spiritually. It's for incorporating rituals that often give thanks, and it promotes reciprocity and respect into research practices and within the dominant paradigm, which is Western ways of knowing. And yeah, so it's just like Indigenous ceremonial practices. Okay, historical context. Yeah, so this is very interesting because I think that to understand education, Indigenous pedagogies, you need to know the past, present, the past in order to know the present, in order to really see, I guess, the projection into the future. There's often a trope that we have as Indigenous peoples is to know the 7 generations, which is 7 generations back, 7 generations ahead, which is in residential schools part of the force we learned in the past as part of a forced assimilation policies devastated many Indigenous groups, especially even the Inuit up north. And it's just affected all of them. And it's rooted in the Indian Act of 1867, which has been amended many times. It was aimed to destroy the Indian within the child, objectifying the Indigenous body, which would often see, as many tropes say, like the drunken Indian, or this often labeling that they would often find associated with filth and abject. And so Indigenous languages and leading to trauma and loss of cultural diversity. The impact was great, disrupting and the transmission, the traditional systems and practices. A legacy still felt today. So shifts in policies, educational policies have shifted and evolved through the inclusive practices, which was marked by legislative changes like the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, advocates for integrating Indigenous perspectives in education. A notable example of this change would be the jurisprudence of the French language charter in Quebec, where the community of the Ganawagi was affected, and where they established their own education systems to combat the application forms that the Quebec government was giving to immigrants at that time. They gave the same immigration forms to the Indigenous people of Ganawagi, and so they didn't have it. They started out by teaching the Kanien'kehá:ka language with mothers and houses, and it just evolved since then. And then they opened up many different schools. And in the Indigenous ways of knowing, it's often based off of seasonal. It's a completely different approach compared to how we see it in mainstream education, which focuses more on markets. This is complete opposite, focuses on the human body and the seasonal changes, especially when it comes to food sovereignty. So after this Bill 101 has created a cultural sanctuary for over 30 years, it played a vital role in safeguarding and enriching the Kanien'kehá:ka language and culture, the cultural center that they did make. And Donna Goodleaf, she's the executive director at the cultural center. She's also she's also in head in charge for curriculum and pedagogies for Concordia, where she implemented the micro land-based program, which I had the pleasure of experiencing. So today's significant resurgence of Indigenous knowledge, voices, and teaching methods. This revival counters historical erasure and promotes reconciliation, emphasizing the importance of Indigenous cultures in education. So the Cultural Center is success in language and the Language and Cultural Center, the revitalization in Ganawagi. It's basically their spirit when it comes to group building and this relational agency that you would see that they're using it through their own economic developments, Indigenous economic developments, which institutionalize many different bodies and different institutions in their community. by diverse campaigning, diverse funding, including government support and local municipalities. Which is the cultural center. It's a development that's happening right now. It's close to 60 million. And yeah, they're going to be expecting to make that by next year or the year after, which exemplifies this spirit, right? Since past, present, and future. It's this type of tenacity, a spiritual tenacity that extends beyond language, which includes cultural tourism, partnerships with different corporations, and it also addresses some of the sections in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's goals and showcasing communities' dedication to cultural preservation. Okay, so the land-based micro program at Concordia University is very interesting. I think that it's actually ahead of its time in terms of in theory and practice. I think that it should be, instead of a certificate for the undergraduate, it should be definitely a graduate certificate, but that's all ends and means here. So the Concordia Land-Based Program is an immersive approach program, practical skills and ecological awareness through a direct interaction with the environment. It is rooted in traditional indigenous traditions and ways of knowing, valued in a lived connection with the land, and providing that thanks, and that reciprocity. Yeah, as one of the scholars that I'm going to be using here is Tako Teknoho, notes that it's about exploring connections with the land, critical for addressing intergenerational trauma, like I mentioned, and in the loss of indigenous cultural and knowledge transmission. Carrie Rice, a fellow student in First People Studies program, a student in the land-based microprojects program, values the richness of the hands-on work for both reconnecting with his Ganikahaga culture and learning new skills. He noted the practicality and real-life applicability of the program, contrasting with more theoretical aspects of other classes, which I find very interesting because the class is enriched with journaling, it's enriched with academic rigor for individualized base. And then when you do show up on the land, you learn all these ecological learning and geological positioning, and where you feel aware of where you are historically as a person and how you relate culturally. I think that indigenous pedagogies integrates ecological learning in a very respectful and just like a natural way of promoting a natural relationship, a symbiotic relationship between people and the environment, with an emphasis on geological positionality and awareness, like I mentioned, critical for cultural resurgence, such as myself. It's the reasons why I chose First People Studies in the first place. I think personally, me being a millennium scoop, I was removed before the age of 1, placed in multiple foster homes, with my mom being a 60 scoop survivor. It was the perfect thing for me to go after college. And I think that this program, this micro-based program, it opens the doors for many different opportunities for students to learn from the land and just bring in that type of information that will be more efficient for them in comparison to just learning in a room being tested all the time. Yeah, so the connection with the land, which academically it promotes scholarship through research, thus building engagement with the community and economic development for both indigenous and non-indigenous communities with Jojagi and Ganawage, and collective strength within an educational framework that values hands-on relational learning and group building and problem solving, a rigorous balance of both theory and practice. Yeah, so and then here's another testimony that I got, personal communication. I like to put it as oral tradition. Sebastian Patterson, which he himself shared critical importance into the practical applications of this education in human environments, which he studies, expressing enthusiasm for real life skills like shelter construction, knotwork, firecraft, and identifying flora and fauna, which I would like to also add that there's also an emphasis in studying the plants and tracking, and also in my personal favorite, in my Mi'kmaq perspective, which would be fungi. He noted that the significance of learning these skills from indigenous structures, which to him underscores the integration of indigenous perspectives in his study, which I find is very important, and just changing and challenging and opposing the colonial narrative. Indigenous community values and curriculum. Yeah, so this is very interesting. Yeah, so respect for traditions. The curricula must combine respect for elders, which is very, very important for the transmission of wisdom. And I think that it's just this idea of it allows students to connect with their heritage and community, right? And it's just this is also this community aspect which it collaborates with learning. So it's not just this individualized based. You're emphasizing more of collaboration, which is indigenous led in its way that it promotes not only learning but also community activities that involves everyone in the educational process. Nature and the environment and education, I think, is also very important when you compare it with when you're in class and you're often in class and you're closed in. It's the same kind of environment, which is okay, you know, for certain students who would like to focus in that certain way. But land in of itself and nature offers a different type of balance when it comes to incorporating that same potential that we often see in classrooms that involve just you know, tests and teachers. And it's also consensus and decision making, which is indigenous education often consensus that permits a circle method of reflecting the community values of the group. Yeah, so here, hold on here. Cultural I like how I'm in the middle. Heritage preservation, combining cultural heritage and curricular ensures the continuation of vitality of indigenous knowledge, languages, and arts, and also traditions. Like I mentioned, elders as knowledge keepers. Elders play a critical role as knowledge keepers because they have to pass down wisdom to knowledge holders, which using their traditions, which is critical for parts of educational content, which I believe that even bringing in an elder in on the end and on the in the beginning, or even at the same time in the middle of the educational process, would be respecting in that way. It's giving thanks to the knowledge that's being passed down through land-based education. And indigenous axiology, ontology, axiological approaches, human applied sciences. I think it's very important for understanding and valuing indigenous axiological approaches, which is the patterns of the different patterns and how they might approach different things, which is in itself scientifically chaotic, but in indigenous ways of knowing, it's relational. It's completely relational, which is key to creating curricula that truly reflects indigenous ways of knowing and learning, right? Okay. All right. Okay, so reconciliation with Western education. Yes, it's important to blend indigenous and Western way systems. Like I've mentioned, the overlap between seeing a certain way and seeing another way. My whole life, you know, I lived in the city. That's all I knew. So the integration of indigenous methods into mainstream education, which is dominant, which is Western education, is challenging. For sure, it's challenging. Like I mentioned, the micro land-based program, it opens up the door to many different questions. Like, how does the program create partnership with indigenous communities to ensure, you know, practical applications of both land-based practicality and theoretical knowledge? Or like, how does the program connect with theories with local communities, ensuring that the combination of indigenous frameworks or knowledges is into the hands-on activities is ethical and respectful, especially if it being a new program. You know, how does it ensure both cultural safety and security, and how, is it feasible? You know, these limitations are important to ask. And I've been trying to communicate as much as I can with the director of curricular and pedagogies, which is Donna Goodleaf. No email yet, but I have been talking to Catherine Richardson. She was a great leader, a great spiritual leader. I've great respects for her, and she has told me some stuff. Yeah, so yeah, it's important, you know, to embrace indigenous histories because it's going to address trauma. It's going to coincide with the philosophies that go along with conventional ways of doing. It's not going to be easy to find this kind of balance. And it's like I mentioned, it's the program in itself, the micro program. It's not easy. It's tackling cultural biases in education that's going to be tough. It's just because mainstream educational systems often harbor Eurocentric biases that can create this cognitive imperialistic ways of doing things. and it's just actively working to identify and eliminate these biases is critical for creating an inclusive and fair learning environment for everyone, like what Rami Camel said on one of our classes. It's really that moment where you see a student light up. It brings joy and just even hope to an educator's heart. Yeah, so inclusive color curricular design, incorporating Indigenous knowledges, IK, and worldviews into standardized curricula not only enriches the educational experiences, but promotes a more accurate and comprehensive understanding of diverse histories and cultures. Again, this is very important stuff. Like, it should be, should be simple to understand that we have been doing certain things and it hasn't been working. It's not sustainable. We shouldn't be focused too much on the markets and focus more on the human. It's important, like the importance of Indigenous educators and instructors is to work together to use instrumentally in bridging the gap when it comes to these divides, because their role goes beyond teaching. They bring invaluable perspectives and experiences that can transform and bridge the gap for educational landscape for Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students, which will create cultural safety and ensure feasibility, I guess. And overlapping, here we go again. Educational approaches. Comparing Indigenous and conventional educational approaches reveals stark differences, positive differences, stark positive differences. Indigenous education focuses on community involvement, and holistic learning offers a refreshing contrast to the often individualistic nature of dominant education, which often of itself is not accommodating for many different students. Okay, Indigenous versus Western education. I feel like we've come a bit into that. Experimental versus theoretical learning. Indigenous learning through direct experiences, which I could mention myself. I've been in pro seminars when it came to land-based training, which they were doing evaluations before this micro land-based program started. And myself, I enjoyed the aspect of group building in comparison to problem solving. I think that when you look at how to see how a group does it in comparison to just seeing the effect, it's better to focus more on how everyone makes that cause happen, because then you could really start to focus on the theoretical, I guess, aspects that in order to abstract those concepts. And then, there's also here class-based instruction, which is survival training, and it's just this community-centric versus the individualistic classrooms. Indigenous emphasizes in collective learning, group building, like I mentioned, community involvement, and shared decision-making. Mainstream, it prioritizes individual achievement, problem solving, and competition, meritocracy, etc. Cultural identity versus academic sources. Indigenous supports strong cultural identity, connection to community and the land. Mainstream often oriented towards standardized tests and individual academic milestones and institutional adequacies, which I mentioned with when it comes to accommodations. Incorporating Indigenous pedagogies. Increasing the emphasis on integrating Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in mainstream education, benefiting all students with a more holistic worldview. I think Indigenous holistic ways of knowing when it comes to comparing it with standardized assessments, there's no brainer here. Indigenous assesses personal growth on a collective scale. In comparison to what relies on standardized tests and academic benchmarks, which I find it's not practical in of itself. It's more theory. And how much theory do we actually retain? What, less than 10% each year? It's not sufficient. It's not sustainable. So conclusion from further research, decolonizing education summary. We examined decolonizing education's impact, the legacy of residential schools, and the resurgence of Indigenous pedagogies. I think the key themes included the land-based education's role, and in what I had mentioned, the micro-based land-based program that they have at Concordia, which in itself, it focuses on getting you into the First People Studies program, which, it's not perfect, but, it comes with a certain level of practicality that it equips you for areas that involve, I guess, embracing educational approaches to a holistic learning experience, which, respects Indigenous perspectives. So, yeah, Embracing educational diversity. The discussion we emphasized was the necessity of embracing diverse educational approaches for holistic experiences learning. And then I call for collaborative efforts. A continuing collaboration between Indigenous and mainstream educational systems, I think, is critical for creating a culturally sensitive and inclusive educational environment. Further research, I find that for further insight, explore works by Leanne Simpson and Takao Takahano, and research on Indigenous methodologies in education. And also, which I find very important, support local and out of region Indigenous economic developments and artists. Like, go to your powwows, go to your local powwows, work on the reservation, find some jobs there, because when you're doing this, you're providing support financially to these economic developments that are inherently Indigenous. And in Quebec, we need that. When it comes to, there's no Métis association here in Quebec. You do not recognize them. So I think in Quebec is very important. Everywhere else in Canada, they have many different friendship centers. They have many different institutions that are inherently more Indigenous than when it comes to Quebec. It's completely the opposite. There's only one friendship center. There's only one Native Montreal. There's Native resilience. There's a lot of issues going on with the homeless. And I think that even discrimination amongst Natives does exist. Nothing is perfect. And I think that just by giving a little bit more attention to the economic development of Indigenous peoples, it will help them. And I really love Leanne Simpson's work. I think her explorations into Anishinaabe intelligence and spiritual intelligence is very important. Culturally, I think that the microland based program, it's a winner. It's a no-brainer when it comes to embracing Indigenous ways of knowing and overlapping that with the common dominant research paradigm of Western education. So also to the cultural center, like I mentioned in Ganawagi, it's a very enriched center. It's a big, humongous. There's many architect firms that are working now with that, and many different campaigning partners that are going to be investing into that development. And I think that its success in cultural preservation and language revitalization is superb. And when it comes to group building and bringing in this relational agency of all these different institutions. And any reviews of the recommendations related to education for understanding these efforts can be checked in different calls for action when it comes to the Truth and Reconciliations Commission's report, and even reports on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and trans and plus two-spirited. I think it's very appreciated. And Indigenous mainstream education. One important aspect I forgot to mention is that the key term that the concept that they would like to use in Indigenous instruction is the appreciative inquiry, which it's basically that, like I mentioned, it's the up top approach instead of the top down approach, that it gives the relational aspect of allowing students to figure out on their own and how they come together as one mind, good spirit, and good heart to decide for themselves what they want, instead of the teacher often coming through with this top-down approach, which is inherently language of domination. Okay. Yeah, so I want to finish here with a closing ceremony. This is again Robin Wall Kimmerer. Closing ceremony. I think that the embers of the great flame, it's what we bring in together when it comes to research, in order to have different even parties to contribute and to really say what they feel is good, in order to address an interconnected approach of handling not a problem, but a collective challenge that we all have to come together and decide what we can do. So amidst the ancient whispers of the land, we gather around the sacred fire. Its flames, like the beating heart of the earth, remind us of the connection to this hallowed ground. As we offer our prayers and ceremonies, we honor the land that sustains us. In the fire that purifies our intentions, in this union of earth and flame, we find the essence of our spirituality, a communion of the sacred. and the elemental, a reminder that we are a but of a part of a greater tapestry of existence. That I think it's very beautiful. All right. Okay. Here's the, oh, again, and also I'd like to mention that Indigenous people since the 2021 consensus make up around 5% of the total population. Given the historical colonial narrative, I think that's important to stick to keep in mind when it comes to addressing the colonial aspect of colonization. And yeah, with that, I thank you. Wallahi.